There are books that sit quietly on shelves for decades, waiting for the right person to open them at exactly the right moment in their life. And then there are books that reach through time itself, grab you by the collar and say, "Hey, stop what you are doing. There is something you need to understand about how you are living." William DeWitt Hyde wrote one of those books. He called it Practical Ideals, and the title alone is a kind of quiet revolution, because most people spend their whole lives believing that ideals and practicality are enemies of each other. That you have to choose between the dream and the doing. That you can either be a visionary or a realist, but never both at once. Hyde came along and said, with the calm authority of a man who had thought deeply about everything, "No, you have it backwards. The most practical thing a human being can ever do is to live by their ideals." And if you give the next several minutes your full attention, I think you will walk away from this summary seeing your own life, your choices, your ambitions, and your relationships in a completely different light. William DeWitt Hyde was the president of Bowdoin College in Maine for many years at the turn of the 20th century. He was a philosopher, an educator, a theologian, and one of those rare human beings who actually practiced what he preached. He did not write from a position of comfortable theory. He wrote from decades of watching young people enter his college full of fire and dreams, and then watching the world slowly convince them to put those dreams away. He watched ambition harden into cynicism. He watched generosity shrink into self-protection. He watched people who had once believed in something beautiful learn to be afraid of their own best impulses. And he decided he could not stay quiet about it any longer. The central argument of this book is both simple and staggering. It is this: the ideals that we tend to think of as impractical, things like honesty, beauty, justice, service, love, discipline, and character, are not luxuries that we add to life after we have secured our survival. They are the very foundation of a life that actually works. A life without them does not become more practical. It becomes hollow. It becomes exhausted. It becomes a long list of achievements that somehow add up to nothing. Hyde believed, and demonstrated chapter by chapter, that the person who lives by genuine ideals is not the naive dreamer stumbling through a hard world. That person is, in fact, the most strategic, the most resilient, the most genuinely effective human being in any room they walk into. Let us begin where Hyde himself begins, with the question of what a human being actually is. Hyde opens by asking us to think about our own nature, not in a theological or scientific way, but in a plainly observational way. What do you actually want? Not what do you think you should want, or what the people around you have decided they want, or what the advertisements tell you to want. What do you, in the quietest and most honest part of yourself, actually want? Hyde argues that when people answer this question with real honesty, the answer is almost never purely material. It is almost never just money, or security, or status, though those things appear in the answer sometimes. What people actually want, when they stop performing and start reflecting, is something like meaning. Something like connection, something like the feeling that their days are not wasted, that they are growing, that they are part of something larger than themselves, that they matter to someone, that what they do with their one life has some kind of worth. And this is where Hyde makes his first great move, because he points out that these desires, these deep human longings for meaning and connection and worth, are not weaknesses. They are not distractions from the real work of life. They are the real work of life. They are the signal of what human beings are actually built for. And when we structure our lives around chasing things that do not speak to these deep desires, we do not become happy. We become restless. We become people who have everything and feel nothing. We become the cautionary tale that other people tell at dinner parties about how money does not buy happiness, while privately wondering why their own money has not bought it yet either. Think about someone you know. Maybe you have met this person, or maybe you are this person yourself, who spent 20 years climbing a particular ladder, working hard, making real sacrifices, giving up time and relationships and health to get to a certain place. And then they got there. And the view from the top was not what they expected. Not because they were ungrateful or broken or wrong somehow, but because the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. Because the goal was defined entirely in external terms, and the internal life, the part of them that needed growth and purpose and genuine connection, had been quietly starving the whole time. Hyde saw this pattern over and over again in the young men he educated, and he wrote this book as a kind of compass, not to tell people where to go, but to help them understand how to tell the difference between a direction that leads somewhere real and a direction that only looks like it does from a distance. Now, Hyde was a man of his time, and some of the specific examples he uses reflect the era and the particular social world he inhabited, but his fundamental insights transcend all of that completely. The architecture of character he describes, The way that honesty and courage and service and discipline build on each other and reinforce each other and create a kind of inner structure that can bear the weight of an actual life. That architecture is as relevant today as it was when he first drew it. In some ways, it is more relevant because we live in a time of extraordinary distraction, in a world that has perfected the art of making shallow things look deep and shallow choices look like sophisticated ones. Hyde's book cuts through all of that noise with a quiet, steady clarity that is almost startling. One of the chapters that hits hardest, and that Hyde returns to in different forms throughout the book, is his treatment of honesty. Not honesty in the simple sense of not telling lies, though that is certainly part of it, but honesty in the larger sense of being genuinely who you are, of not performing a version of yourself designed to win approval or avoid conflict, of not shaping your opinions to match the room, of not pretending certainty you do not have or doubt you do not feel. Hyde believed that this kind of fundamental honesty is not just a moral virtue, it is a practical necessity. Because a person who is not honest with themselves and others cannot make good decisions. They are navigating by a map they know is wrong and then wondering why they keep ending up in the wrong place. There is a story, not from Hyde's book but from the kind of life his book is about, of a young woman who spent years in a career that looked impressive from the outside. She had the title, the salary, the apartment, the kind of life that made her parents proud when they described it to their friends. But every Sunday evening she felt a weight settle over her that she could not name. She told herself it was normal. She told herself everyone feels this way. She told herself to be grateful, and then one day she sat very quietly with herself and asked the question she had been avoiding for a long time, which was, is this actually what I want? Or is this what I chose because I was afraid of choosing something else? The answer, when she finally stopped running from it, was the second one. And once she had that answer, once she was honest with herself in the way that Hyde describes, everything else followed with a clarity that surprised her. She did not immediately quit her job or blow up her life, but she started making choices from a real place instead of a fearful one, and the weight, slowly, began to lift. That is what Hyde means by honesty as a practical ideal. It is not about confession or disclosure. It is about the relationship you have with your own truth. And he argues, compellingly and at length, that a person who has that relationship with their own truth is capable of a quality of decision-making, a quality of relationship, a quality of creative and professional work that is simply not available to someone who is managing a performance. Because managing a performance takes energy, enormous amounts of energy that could be going into something real. Hyde then turns his attention to something he calls the ideal of excellence, and this section of the book is worth its weight in gold for anyone who is serious about doing good work in any field. Hyde is not interested in excellence as a competitive concept. He is not talking about being better than other people, or winning, or dominating any particular arena. He is talking about excellence as a relationship with the work itself, as a commitment to giving something your genuine best effort because the work deserves it, and because you, as the person doing the work, deserve the experience of doing it at your highest level. He makes a distinction here that I think is one of the most useful things in the entire book. He distinguishes between working to get something, which is a fundamentally anxious and transactional mode of working, and working to be something, which is an entirely different experience. When you work to get something, your attention is split between the task in front of you and the reward you are hoping for. You are never fully present in the work. You are always calculating, always comparing, always measuring whether the effort matches the expected return. And this split attention actually makes the work worse. It makes it less creative, less courageous, less genuinely excellent. But when you work to be something, when you work because you are committed to being a person of excellence and integrity in craft, you do not have that split. Your attention is whole. You bring everything you have to what is in front of you, not because of what you will get from it, but because of what you will become through it. And ironically, this mode of working tends to produce far better external results than the first mode does. Not because the universe rewards virtue with success in some simple arithmetic way, but because genuinely excellent work is genuinely excellent. People can feel it. It stands out. It lasts. There is a master craftsman somewhere in Japan, a man who has spent 50 years making wooden bowls, who when asked why he put such extraordinary care into pieces that most buyers will use for ordinary things, answered simply, because the bowl deserves it. That is Hydean excellence. That is the practical ideal of craft and attention as a way of being in the world. Hyde also spends considerable time on the ideal of service, and this is where his thinking gets particularly interesting and perhaps a little counterintuitive. In the popular understanding, service means giving things up. It means sacrifice, depletion, putting yourself last, and Hyde acknowledges that genuine service does sometimes involve real cost. But he argues that the fundamental experience of service, when it is freely chosen and genuinely motivated, is not depletion at all. It is the opposite. It is a kind of expansion, a kind of aliveness. He points to the observable fact that people who give their energy, their time, their skill to causes and communities beyond themselves tend to be, on average, more vital, more engaged, more genuinely satisfied with their lives than people who concentrate entirely on their own advancement. This is not a sentimental observation. It is one that has been confirmed by research many times over in the century since Hyde wrote. People who volunteer, who mentor, who contribute to something beyond themselves, report higher levels of meaning and lower levels of the dull, nameless dissatisfaction that plagues so many lives that look successful from the outside. Hyde's explanation for this is elegant. He says that human beings are built for participation. We are not self-contained units. We are nodes in a network of relationship and contribution. And when we try to exist as if we are self-contained, when we try to live as though our only real obligations are to ourselves, we cut ourselves off from one of the deepest sources of energy and meaning available to us. We are, in a very real sense, operating below our own capacity. We are living at reduced power. He tells us that the young person who asks, "What can I get out of this?" when approaching their education or career or community is not being practical. They are being, in the deepest sense, self-defeating, because the question cuts them off from the very thing that would make their work and their life feel alive. The person who asks, "What can I contribute here? What does this situation need that I might be able to provide?" is not being naive. They are accessing a source of motivation and energy and fulfillment that the first person will spend their whole life unable to reach, no matter how much they accumulate. And around this point in our journey through the book, if you are listening to this and finding it genuinely useful, please do consider hitting the like button and subscribing to Audiobook Library. It helps the channel grow and means these kinds of deep, thoughtful book summaries reach more people who need them. Every subscription genuinely matters, and it takes about 2 seconds of your time. We would love to have you with us for the long journey. Now, back to Hyde, because we have reached one of the most practically important sections of his work, which is his treatment of self-discipline and what he calls the education of desire. This is where Hyde gets genuinely radical, because he is not just talking about willpower in the ordinary sense. He is not giving us tips on productivity or tricks for resisting temptation. He is making a far more fundamental claim about human freedom. He argues that most people, when they think about freedom, think about the absence of constraint. Freedom means being able to do whatever you want, whenever you want, without anyone or anything stopping you. And Hyde says, with great patience and considerable evidence, that this is precisely backwards. That freedom understood this way is actually a form of slavery, because if you can only do what you feel like doing in any given moment, then you are completely controlled by your momentary feelings. You are at the mercy of every impulse, every fear, every passing mood. You cannot build anything. You cannot sustain anything. You cannot become anything. You are just being pushed around by the weather of your own emotional states. Real freedom, Hyde argues, is the freedom that comes from having trained your desires so that what you want to do and what is good for you are increasingly the same thing. It is the freedom that a great musician has, who has practiced so thoroughly that the music flows without effort. It is the freedom that a person of genuine character has, who does not have to deliberate every morning about whether to be honest today, because honesty has become their natural mode of operation. It is the freedom that comes not from removing all structure, but from having built the right internal structure. This is a discipline not of suppression, but of cultivation. Hyde is not asking us to crush our desires or deny our pleasures or become joyless ascetics moving through the world with tight lips and disapproving eyes. He is asking us to pay attention to the education of our desires, to notice that some desires, when we feed them, grow and deepen and connect us to greater things. And other desires, when we feed them, shrink us and isolate us and leave us emptier than before. And to make the long-term choice over and over again, to cultivate the ones that enlarge us and gently redirect the energy of the ones that diminish us. Think of it this way. There are two people who have both just finished a long, hard week of work. Both of them feel the desire to decompress, to rest, to step back from effort. The first person pours that desire into several hours of passive consumption, scrolling, watching, absorbing without any real engagement. The second person goes for a long walk, calls a friend they have been meaning to talk to, cooks something they enjoy making. Both people are responding to the same underlying desire for rest and renewal, but the quality of the rest is completely different. The first person, after several hours, often feels not more restored but somehow more depleted, a little more hollow, a little more disconnected. The second person feels genuinely renewed, not because they were more disciplined in some punishing sense, but because they have learned, through practice and attention, to direct the desire for restoration toward the things that actually restore them. Hyde says this kind of education of desire is one of the central tasks of an examined life. And it is not a task you complete once. It is a daily ongoing practice of paying attention, of asking not just what do I want, but what do I want to want? What kind of person do I want to be becoming? And what does this choice I am making right now have to do with that? There is a man, a real person, a teacher who worked in a difficult school in a difficult neighborhood for 30 years. Not because he could not leave, not because he did not have other options, but because at some point in his early career he had asked himself the question Hyde asks, which is, what am I actually for? What is my genuine contribution? And the answer he got back when he sat with it honestly was that he was for this particular kind of work, in this particular kind of place, with these particular kids who did not have enough adults in their lives who believed they were capable of greatness. He was not a martyr. He was not performing sacrifice. He was a man who had educated his desires to the point where his work and his joy were pointing in the same direction. He said once, near the end of his career, "I never felt like I was giving something up. I felt like I was always running towards something." That is what Hyde is describing when he talks about the practical ideal of service and the education of desire combining into a life that has a kind of coherent, forward-moving energy to it. Now let us spend some time with what Hyde says about relationships, because this is another area where his thinking cuts against some of our most common assumptions. We live in a time that fetishizes independence. The cultural ideal, in so many of the messages we absorb, is the self-sufficient individual who needs no one, who has everything figured out on their own, who is their own foundation and their own resource. And Hyde, in his gentle and persistent way, dismantles this ideal completely. Not because independence is bad, but because it is incomplete, because it misunderstands what human beings actually are. Hyde argues that we become ourselves through our relationships. That the capacity for genuine love and friendship and loyalty is not a soft add-on to a real life. It is constitutive of a real life. It is part of what makes us the kind of beings we are, and that when we treat our relationships as instrumental, as means to our own ends, as resources to be managed rather than people to be genuinely known and loved, we damage not just the relationship but ourselves. We cut off our own growth at the root. He writes about friendship with particular care and particular warmth. He distinguishes between friendships of convenience, which are pleasant and useful but ultimately thin, and friendships of character, which are built on genuine mutual understanding and genuine mutual regard and genuine mutual commitment to each other's growth. The second kind of friendship, he says, is one of the greatest available goods in a human life, not because it makes you feel good in any simple sense, though it often does, but because it gives you access to a kind of honest reflection that you cannot get from anyone else. A true friend, in Hyde's sense, is someone who sees you clearly and loves you anyway, and who cares enough about you to tell you the truth even when the truth is uncomfortable. This is different from what passes for friendship in much of social life, which is often a mutual agreement to tell each other what we want to hear, to support each other's decisions regardless of whether those decisions are wise, to perform closeness without doing the harder work of actually being known. Hyde says this kind of friendship, while pleasant, ultimately fails both people, because it does not help either of them grow. It does not call forth the best in either of them. It is a comfort that comes at the cost of real development, and he extends this thinking about relationships into his treatment of what he calls civic virtue, which is the set of obligations and contributions we have to the communities we are part of. This is not about politics in any partisan sense. It is about the recognition that we exist in and through communities, that the air we breathe and the roads we drive on and the institutions we rely on and the culture that shapes our values and our imagination are all collective achievements maintained by collective effort, and that to benefit from a community without contributing to it is a kind of moral inconsistency. It is taking something real and giving nothing back. Hyde is not guilt-tripping anyone here. He is not listing obligations in a way designed to make you feel bad about watching television or going to the beach. He is making the more interesting and more generous point that contributing to your community is not a burden. It is an opportunity to be part of something larger than yourself, an opportunity to exercise capacities that cannot be exercised in purely private life, an opportunity for the particular kind of meaning that only comes from being genuinely useful to people beyond your immediate circle. He uses the example of a town, and he paints a picture of two kinds of residents. One kind lives in the town, uses its resources, participates in its economy, enjoys its safety and its amenities, but considers the town's problems to be someone else's business. The other kind considers the town partly their responsibility. They show up to meetings sometimes, they know their neighbors, they support local institutions, they pay attention to what is happening and add their voice and their energy when it is needed. And Hyde's point is not just that the second kind of resident makes the town better, though they do. His point is that the second kind of resident has a richer, fuller, more genuinely engaged life. They are part of something. They belong somewhere in a real sense. They are practicing a kind of active citizenship that exercises parts of their humanity that would otherwise go dormant. And here is where Hyde's thinking about practical ideals converges into what I find to be the most powerful section of the entire book, which is his argument about character as the ultimate practical achievement. Character, for Hyde, is not a fixed thing you either have or do not have. It is not a gift or a genetic endowment. It is the cumulative result of the choices you make, the habits you build, the desires you educate, the relationships you maintain, the ideals you refuse to abandon even when abandoning them would be easier. Character is what you become through the practice of practical ideals over time, and it is, he argues, the only thing that actually makes life work in the long run. He is aware that this sounds almost quaint in a world that celebrates disruption and novelty and the quick result, but he makes the case patiently and powerfully. Every institution, every organization, every community, every relationship ultimately runs on character, on the question of whether the people involved can be trusted, whether they will do what they say they will do, whether they have the courage to make hard decisions and the honesty to own the consequences of their choices, whether they bring their genuine best to the work or just enough to avoid criticism. Character is not irrelevant to success. It is the substrate that either supports or undermines every other form of success. Think about the organizations you have worked in or known about. Think about the ones that were genuinely excellent, that had a culture of real quality and real care and real accountability. And then think about the ones that were toxic or mediocre or corrosive in some less obvious way. What is the difference between them? You can always trace it back, if you're honest, to character. To whether the people in positions of leadership were people of genuine integrity or people who were primarily managing appearances. To whether the culture rewarded honesty or punished it. To whether the fundamental relationship between the institution and the people inside it was one of genuine respect or one of extraction. Hyde would not be surprised by any of this. He knew it a century ago. He knew that the attempt to build excellence on any foundation other than character is like trying to build a house on sand. It might look impressive for a while, but it cannot hold. Near the 10-minute mark of this journey, it is worth pausing to take in just how comprehensive Hyde's vision actually is. He is not writing about one part of life or one domain of human experience. He is writing about the whole thing, about how the ideals of honesty and excellence and service and discipline and friendship and civic responsibility and genuine love are not separate topics with separate applications. They are facets of a single integrated way of being in the world, a way of being that Hyde calls the life of practical ideals. And his most radical claim, the one that ties everything together, is that this way of being is not just morally better than the alternative. It is more effective. It produces better results. It makes people more genuinely capable, more genuinely creative, more genuinely powerful in the real sense of the word, which is the ability to affect the world in ways that matter. There is a particular kind of brilliance in the way Hyde handles the objections to his view, because he knows and addresses directly the most common arguments that people make against living by ideals. The argument that the world is too hard and too corrupt and too competitive for ideals to survive contact with reality. The argument that idealism is fine for people who can afford it, for people who have already secured their safety, but that people who are struggling cannot afford the luxury of principles. The argument that history is full of idealists who got crushed and pragmatists who succeeded. Hyde takes each of these seriously and then dismantles them one by one. His response to the first argument, that the world is too harsh for ideals, is essentially this: you are confusing ideals with naivety. An ideal is not a belief that the world is nicer than it is. An ideal is a commitment to being a particular kind of person and building a particular kind of life, regardless of what the world throws at you. The person of genuine character is not fragile in the face of difficulty. They are, in fact, far more resilient than the person who has nothing to fall back on but their circumstances. Because when circumstances change, as they always do, the person of character has their character. They have the internal resources to adapt, to endure, to rebuild, to remain themselves. Whereas the person who has built their identity entirely on external achievements and positions and possessions has nothing left when those things are gone or threatened. Think of two business people who both lose their companies in an economic downturn. One has built their identity entirely around being successful, around the status and the lifestyle and the external proof of their worth. When the company goes, something essential in them collapses with it. They cannot separate themselves from the failure. They cannot see a path forward because the path they were on has disappeared. The other person also loses the company, and it hurts genuinely and deeply, but they have something the first person does not. They have a clear sense of who they are that exists outside of the outcome. They have relationships built on something real. They have values and abilities and a way of showing up in the world that belongs to them rather than to the company. They grieve the loss, and then they begin again, not because they are tougher in some superficial sense, but because they have more. They have character. And character, Hyde would tell you, is the only truly portable wealth. His response to the argument that idealism is a luxury for the privileged is perhaps the most moving part of the book. Because Hyde grew up in circumstances that were not comfortable, and he spent his life working with young people who came from all sorts of backgrounds. And his observation was that idealism, genuine idealism, is not correlated with material comfort at all. In fact, he saw over and over again that the people who maintained their integrity and their commitment to something larger than themselves under the greatest pressure were often the people with the fewest external resources. And that the people who most quickly abandoned their ideals under pressure were often those who had the most to lose, and therefore the most fear. He argues that idealism is not a luxury. It is, in fact, particularly important for people who are struggling, because a person who is struggling without any ideals to guide them is simply being crushed. But a person who is struggling with a genuine commitment to their own integrity and their own values and their own sense of what a good life looks like is a person who is going somewhere, who has a direction, who, even in the middle of difficulty, is building something real. There is a story that belongs here, not Hyde's story, but the kind of story Hyde's book illuminates. There was a young man who grew up in very difficult circumstances, in a family that had almost nothing, in a neighborhood that offered very few easy paths forward. He had every reason, by the calculus of pure circumstance, to take the shortcuts that were available to him. Many of the people he grew up with did, but there was something in him, some commitment he had made early to being a particular kind of person. He did not have the vocabulary for it then. He did not think of himself as an idealist, but he had decided, in some very fundamental way, that he would not sacrifice his integrity for convenience. Not because he thought it would necessarily pay off, but because he could not live with himself if he did. He struggled for a long time. He made choices that looked foolish from the outside. He turned down opportunities that came with strings he could not accept. He worked jobs that were beneath his ability because they were honest. And then, slowly, the accumulation of choices that came from a real place rather than a fearful one began to add up into something. Not overnight, not in any dramatic Hollywood way, but steadily, the way a tree grows, the way a river shapes a canyon, through continuous patient pressure in the same direction. He became someone people trusted absolutely. He became someone whose word meant something. He became someone who, when the larger opportunities eventually came, was genuinely ready for them because he had built the character that those opportunities required. Hyde would recognize that story instantly, because it is the story his book is about. It is the story of practical ideals in action, not as a philosophical concept, but as a lived reality. Now let us turn to what Hyde says about the relationship between idealism and happiness, because this is where his thinking challenges some of our deepest cultural assumptions most directly. The dominant cultural story about happiness goes something like this. Happiness is the feeling of getting what you want. So the path to happiness is to figure out what you want, acquire it, and protect it. Happiness is fundamentally a state of satisfaction, and the good life is the life that maximizes satisfied desire. Hyde rejects this almost completely, not because he is opposed to pleasure or comfort or the satisfaction of legitimate desires, but because he thinks this framework gets the direction of causation backwards. He argues that happiness, in the deepest and most durable sense, is not the product of getting what you want. It is the byproduct of living in a certain way, of living with integrity, with purpose, with genuine engagement in work that matters, with relationships built on real regard, with contributions that connect you to something beyond yourself. Happiness, in other words, is not a destination you arrive at. It is what you experience when you are genuinely on the path. This is why so many people who achieve their stated goals find themselves strangely unhappy after the achievement. Not because they are ungrateful or broken, but because they were using the goal as a proxy for something deeper that the goal itself cannot provide. The promotion does not provide meaning. The house does not provide belonging. The money does not provide purpose. These things can create the conditions in which meaning and belonging and purpose are easier to develop. But they cannot substitute for them. And the person who has been telling themselves, "I will be happy when," is often devastated to discover that the when has arrived and the happiness has not followed. Hyde's alternative is to stop treating happiness as a goal and start treating it as a consequence. To ask not, "How do I get happy?" But what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of life do I want to be building? What are the ideals I am committed to expressing through how I work and how I love and how I contribute? And then to live that, to actually do that, not perfectly and not without struggle, but consistently in the direction of those answers, and to trust that the life built on those foundations will contain far more genuine happiness, though probably with less of the giddy temporary highs that we confuse for it, than any life built on the pursuit of happiness as a primary goal. He makes a comparison that has stayed with me. He says that seeking happiness directly is like trying to see a dim star by looking directly at it. Astronomers know that if you want to see a very faint star, you do not look straight at it. You look slightly to the side because the peripheral vision is more sensitive to faint light than the direct vision, and the star, when you stop staring directly at it, comes into view. Happiness is like that faint star. When you make it your direct object, it disappears. When you stop chasing it and start living well, it comes into view. Hyde also has much to say about the particular challenges of intellectual life, about education and the development of the mind. And though he was writing specifically about the education of young men at a particular time and place, his underlying principles are universal and timely. He argues that education, genuine education, is not about the acquisition of information. It is not about being filled up with facts or credentials or useful skills, though all of those things have their place. It is about the development of a certain kind of mind, a mind that can think clearly and honestly, a mind that can distinguish between what it knows and what it only believes, a mind that is genuinely curious rather than merely ambitious, a mind that can engage seriously with ideas it disagrees with, a mind that is, in short, free. Not free in the superficial sense of having lots of options, but free in the deeper sense of being able to think for itself, to question its own assumptions, to grow and change in response to genuine argument and genuine evidence. He is worried, and here he sounds remarkably contemporary, about education that produces people who are very good at producing the right answers but have never been taught to ask the right questions. People who have accumulated impressive credentials but who have never actually had the experience of grappling with a genuinely hard problem. People who are skilled performers in the educational system but who lack the deeper capacity for genuine inquiry that would make them capable of original thought or genuine wisdom. What he wants from education, and what he spent his career at Bowdoin trying to provide, is the development of what he calls practical wisdom, which is not the same as either theoretical knowledge or practical skill. It is the capacity to bring genuine intelligence and genuine ethical seriousness to the actual situations of a real life. To know not just what is technically possible, but what is genuinely right. To know not just how to achieve an outcome, but which outcomes are worth achieving. To know not just how to think, but what to think about, and why. This kind of wisdom is, Hyde admits, much harder to develop than either knowledge or skill. It takes time. It takes experience. It takes the willingness to make mistakes and learn from them. It takes the kind of honest self-reflection that most educational systems never ask for and many people spend their whole lives avoiding. But it is, he insists, the thing that makes all the other forms of education actually useful, because knowledge without wisdom is just cleverness, and cleverness without wisdom is, historically, one of the more dangerous things in the world. He spends considerable time on what he calls the duty of imagination, and this is one of the less obvious but deeply important parts of the book. Hyde argues that imagination, the capacity to picture things as other than they are, is not a luxury or a childish indulgence. It is a moral faculty. It is the capacity that allows us to see past our own immediate experience and understand what someone else's life is actually like. It is the root of empathy. Without imagination, we can know in the abstract that other people suffer, but we cannot really feel it. We cannot really care about it in a way that moves us to action. With imagination, we can enter the experience of another person, at least partially, and that partial entry is enough to change how we respond to them. Hyde argues that the failure of imagination is at the root of an enormous amount of human cruelty. Not cruelty motivated by malice, which is relatively rare, but cruelty motivated by indifference, which is common and devastating. The person who treats a waiter carelessly because they cannot imagine what that person's day is like. The manager who sets inhuman expectations because they cannot really picture the cumulative effect on the people beneath them. The politician who supports policies that devastate communities they have never visited or really seen. Hyde says these failures are not just moral failures in the abstract. They are failures of imagination, and the cultivation of imagination is therefore a genuine moral obligation, a practical ideal that demands real effort and real attention. He talks about literature and art not as entertainment but as among the most serious tools available for the development of imagination, because stories, great stories, give us access to the inside of lives and situations we would never otherwise encounter. They develop our capacity to understand experience that is radically different from our own. They make us better at the fundamental human work of recognizing another person as fully real. This is not a small thing. This is, in Hyde's account, one of the most important things a human being can develop. And it requires cultivation. It requires choosing, deliberately and regularly, to engage with stories and images and music that take you beyond the boundaries of your own familiar world. Let us talk now about something Hyde addresses toward the later sections of the book, which is the relationship between idealism and failure, because this is where people most often lose their faith in ideals. When they try to live by their values and it costs them something real, when they are honest and it backfires, when they are generous and it is taken advantage of, when they sacrifice for something and the sacrifice turns out to have been for nothing. These moments are real, and Hyde does not pretend they are not. But he makes a crucial distinction. He distinguishes between the short-term outcome of any particular act of integrity and the long-term trajectory of a life built on integrity. He is not promising that every honest act will be rewarded, or every generous choice will produce gratitude, or every moment of courage will be celebrated. He is not running that argument. He is running a different one. He is saying that the person who maintains their ideals through failure and disappointment and cost becomes someone different, something deeper and more capable, than the person who abandons their ideals the moment they become expensive. He talks about what he calls the refining fire of difficult experience, about how the person who goes through genuine hardship with their character intact comes out the other side with a quality of solidity and depth and earned authority that cannot be faked and cannot be learned any other way. He talks about the particular kind of credibility that belongs to someone who has actually been tested and has actually held, not the credibility of someone who claims to have principles, but the credibility of someone who has proved it, who has been in situations where abandoning their principles would have been easier and more immediately advantageous, and who chose not to. That person is trusted in a different way. That person is listened to in a different way. That person has a presence in a room that is palpable and that money cannot buy and performance cannot replicate. Hyde also returns, in these later chapters, to the theme of beauty. And his treatment of beauty as a practical ideal is one of the most distinctive parts of the entire book. He is not talking about aesthetic luxury or the appreciation of art as a leisure activity. He is talking about something much more fundamental. He is talking about the human need to perceive the world as meaningful and ordered and worthy of attention. And he argues that the person who has cultivated sensitivity to beauty, in nature, in art, in mathematics, in the small daily details of an ordinary life, is a person who has access to a resource of wonder and renewal that is almost inexhaustible. He describes people who have lived through devastating circumstances and somehow maintained their vitality and their engagement with life. And when you look closely at these people, he says, you often find that one of the things that sustained them was precisely this capacity for attention. The ability to notice the particular quality of light on a particular afternoon, to be genuinely moved by a piece of music, to find something in the world, even in the worst of circumstances, that still strikes them as beautiful and therefore is worth continuing for. This is not escapism. It is the opposite of escapism. It is full engagement with the world as it actually is, including the parts of it that are still, even now, astonishing. Hyde believed that the cultivation of this sensitivity is a genuine practical discipline, that choosing to pay attention to beauty, to seek it out, to develop the capacity to perceive it in more and more places, is not a soft or peripheral activity. It is part of what makes human life fully human, part of what makes it worth the trouble. He ends his book, and we are moving toward the end of this summary now too, with what I think is his most essential argument. And it is this, that the dichotomy between idealism and realism is false, that it is, in fact, one of the most costly false dichotomies we have inherited. Because what we call realism, by which we usually mean a kind of resigned acceptance of human selfishness and pettiness and short-sightedness as the fixed and unchangeable truth about people, is not actually realistic. It is a particular and partial view of human nature that mistakes its worst tendencies for its essential ones. Hyde has seen too much of actual human beings to accept this. He has watched people choose courage when cowardice would have been safer. He has watched people act with extraordinary generosity in circumstances that called for none. He has watched people maintain their integrity under pressures that would have bent most others. He has watched students arrive as one kind of person and leave 4 years later as a fundamentally different kind, shaped by genuine education and genuine challenge and genuine community into something more capacious and more capable than they knew they could become. And he says, that is also real. That transformation is real. That capacity for growth and for choosing better than you might have predicted is real. And a realism that leaves it out is not actually realistic. It is simply pessimism disguised as sophistication. The genuine realism, Hyde insists, is one that takes the full range of human possibility into account. One that recognizes both the pull toward selfishness and the pull toward generosity, both the temptation to cut corners and the capacity for genuine excellence, both the desire for comfort and the desire for meaning. And that sees the practical work of a human life as being, in significant part, the work of choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, and with full awareness of the difficulty, which of those pulls to follow. And please, if this summary has given you something to think about, if it has offered you any clarity or any new way of seeing your own life, please do hit like and subscribe to Audiobook Library. These summaries take real time and genuine care to create, and your support is what allows us to keep making them. Every like and every subscription tells the algorithm that this content is worth sharing, and it helps us reach more people who are looking for exactly this kind of thing. We genuinely appreciate every single person who is here with us, and we would love to have you as part of our community. The final teaching of Hyde's book is something he states quietly and without fanfare, and yet it is, I think, the most important thing in it. He says that a human life is not primarily a problem to be solved. It is not a puzzle with a correct answer that you either find or miss. It is an ongoing creative act, a continuous process of choosing and building and revising and growing. And the question that matters is not, did I succeed in some final accounting sense? The question that matters is, was I genuinely alive? Did I show up fully? Did I choose consistently in the direction of my best understanding of what is good and true and beautiful? Did I love well? Did I contribute something real? Did I become slowly and imperfectly and sometimes painfully more myself? These are the questions that Hyde's entire book is really asking. And they are, I think you will agree if you sit with them for a moment, the questions that actually matter. Not just philosophically, but practically. Not just at the end of a life, but in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. Because every ordinary day contains choices. Dozens of them. Small ones and larger ones. Choices about how to treat the person in front of you. About whether to say the true thing or the easy thing. About whether to do the work at the level it deserves or at the level that will barely pass. About whether to invest your attention in something that will expand you or something that will shrink you. About whether to choose from your values or from your fears. Hyde is not asking you to be a saint. He is asking you to be awake, to be genuinely, actively awake to the fact that you are always choosing, and that those choices, accumulated over days and years and decades, add up to your character, and your character adds up to your life, and your life is the only canvas you have, the only opportunity you get to make something real out of your time here. He wrote practical ideals for the young men in his college, but the book belongs to anyone who has ever felt the gap between the life they are living and the life they sense they could be living. Anyone who has ever suspected that there is a more genuine, more purposeful, more deeply satisfying way of being in the world, but has not quite been able to see it clearly enough to reach for it. Hyde sees it clearly, and he describes it with a warmth and a practicality and a deep respect for the actual difficulty of human life that make his work not just inspiring, but genuinely useful. The life he describes is not easy. He never pretends it is. Living by genuine ideals in a world that constantly pressures you to abandon them is a genuine challenge. Maintaining your integrity when it costs you something real is hard. Choosing growth over comfort over and over again is hard. Building relationships of genuine depth instead of settling for pleasant surfaces is hard. Cultivating the imagination and the sensitivity and the self-discipline that a fully human life requires is hard. Hyde knows this. He has lived it. He has watched others live it. And he says, yes, it is hard, and it is worth it. Not because virtue is automatically rewarded, not because the universe is keeping score in your favor, not because everything will work out if you just try hard enough, but because the alternative, a life of abandoned ideals and managed performances and shrinking ambitions and hollowed-out busyness, is not actually easier. It is just a different kind of hard, and it leads somewhere much worse. The practical ideal in the end is not a compromise between dream and reality. It is the recognition that the dream, held honestly and pursued with genuine effort and genuine integrity, is more real than anything you could build by abandoning it. It is the recognition that who you are becoming, slowly and imperfectly, through the daily practice of your values, is more important than almost any external achievement. It is the recognition that a life fully lived, a life of genuine engagement and genuine contribution and genuine love, is the most practical achievement available to a human being. William DeWitt Hyde wrote this book over 100 years ago. He wrote it in a different world, for students in a different situation, using examples from a different time. And yet, if you had not known when it was written, you might have guessed it was written for exactly right now, For this moment, in this strange and overwhelming and beautiful and difficult world where the pressure to perform and consume and optimize and compete has never been more intense, and the need for genuine ideals to navigate by has never been more urgent. Read it if you can find it. But more than that, live it. Let the questions it asks become your questions. Let the ideals it describes become your measuring stick. Let the possibility it points to, of a life that is not just successful but genuinely good, become the horizon you are walking toward. Not because it will be easy, but because it will be real. And real, as Hyde understood better than almost anyone, is the most practical thing there is. Thank you so much for spending this time here with us today. If you made it all the way to the end of this summary, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Please do check out our other videos in our library. There are summaries of other books just like this one waiting for you. Books that challenge and inspire and offer the kind of depth that stays with you long after the listening is over. Hit the like button if this added something to your day. Subscribe to Audiobook Library so you never miss a new video, and share this with someone who you think might need exactly this message today. Because sometimes the right words at the right moment can genuinely change someone's direction, and we believe that is worth doing. We will see you in the next one.